Hi, I'm Grant Bartley. Let's suppose that a revolution for a sustainable global economy happens. For the sake of argument, let's suppose the ecological message that a lot of exasperated people are trying to sell gets seriously brought by the rest of the people. Let's fantasize that somehow revolutionary pro-ecological economic thinking spreads across the world, and that the world gets hold of this thinking, and that the global economy changes. Just then, just when we think we've got it sussed, just when we're sure that we're really evolving as an intelligent species, history will have something hard to say to us. Like many people, I think to make human life both maximally free and ecologically sustainable, the world needs a revolution in the production and distribution of resources. Most likely, any global sustainability revolution will be a mix of ideas, working their way to greater power and influence. Now I'd like us to dive deeper and consider problems with this upcoming eco-revolution, whatever it turns out to be, and through this to discover a deeper problem with human history itself. We might hope the governments of the world will finally come to preside over a socio-economic system dedicated to the realization of a relative paradise of peace and plenty for all, in which all humanity can develop together, well provisioned and unthreatened by war, famine, tyranny, or ecological instability. It's a fine fantasy, isn't it? We should instead rightly suspect that things will not be all good forever in the new garden. The fruit of the coming paradise will soon turn sour, as soon on Eco-Earth trouble begins to stir and hiss. Fast forward a few years from the revolution, and the perfect revolutionary scenario isn't working out so well. It turns out that the price of organic milk and honey for all is that the human race is subject to the stratagems of a new aristocracy. The popular message slogans are merely a sunlit shade of green in contrast to the previous neon shades. But gradually, more and more people began to realize that in creating paradise, we're creating a trap that's slowly closing in on us, as cracks in both experience and expectation begin to reveal the truth. We're being mass greenwashed into a new, global, democratic, ecological servitude. At first, the leaders could simply ignore the marches for freedom as insignificant whining from the middle classes. At first, there wasn't any need for the psychotropic gas or the police stun charges. Then people start disappearing. Now, to more and more people, it's clear that if we don't act fast, the world will be sealed up in this soft totalitarian tyranny of a global aristocracy. For centuries, maybe. As a result, a new revolution is gathering force. Many millions find themselves willing to take violent and rash resistance measures. Global leaders react against this rebellion, of course. All insurgency is crushed by an iron fist. Revolution quashed. As the global vice president herself put it in a speech, the work of entrenching global society into global stability is harsh but necessary. After all, discipline is the price of eternal prosperity on a limited earth. We all know that discipline is the only way the human race can survive what we'd otherwise do to ourselves. I fantasize that humanity moves away from the insanity of our current cash grab consumerism and we instead throw ourselves into the vision of an alternative world order of stability, provision, equality, and freedom. What should we really imagine the future will be like after an eco-revolution? Isn't it just too plausible that even as we redirect the global economic process towards long-term ecological sustainability and whatever else, the powers and their authorities will skillfully carve out a new self-justifying ideology of their power? By the time the new hierarchy is established, it's becoming too late to even be aware of our false ideal. Through eco-revolutionary ideological manipulation, the fair new world becomes just another variation on the old systematic abuse of power by the powerful. The shadowy regime in the story is just the same pattern in a new setting with a new cast. The fear is of the narrowing and ultimate closing of our horizons of thought forever, like prison doors shutting eternally. Suppose today's expansionist economics is replaced by some sort of sustainable economics, that human thinking and life starts going in a globally green direction. Who would argue that the future global ecological society won't itself go fundamentally wrong too? The undeniable evidence of history is that idealism is too easily corrupted. Too often, the new truth that will put things straight has too easily become just another excuse for the party to stamp the shiny jackboot of its authority, metaphorically or otherwise, on the faces of the dissenters and other unfortunates who got in the way. Things weren't always utopian in revolutionary China, for instance. In his wisdom, during the Cultural Revolution, Chairman Mao decided it was better for the sake of China and the communist cause for the party to decimate the population and the culture. Specifically, Mao thought it was a good idea to silence anyone caught within the confines of the Middle Empire showing any hint of non-approved intelligence. Unrestrained curiosity is just too dangerous. So, teachers, free artists, writers, people with glasses, anybody the dumb orthodox bullies didn't like, were singled out and sentenced to rehabilitation, which in its extreme application meant rehabilitation from life. Mao was practically right about this in a morally wrong way. The natural human desire to examine and inevitably criticize powerful opinion is probably the greatest danger to the hierarchy of any established ideology. Someone might convince himself and others that there's something wrong with this and the conditions it justifies. Revolutionary rumblings arising from an epidemic of ideological questioning must be one of the greatest fears for any leader justified by any ideology, which means any leader. If the idea foundations of a ruler's power really are unsound, he's ruling an empire built on lies, isn't he? So though he may desperately try to hold together his house of cards, no campaign of murder can stop his palace of lies from falling. So a leader may panic when threatened by the universal force of human curiosity, as happened at many similar junctures in history. I mean, I'm a Christian, but look at the history of Christianity, a religion that's founded on an ideal of love. The bloody narrative of the international body of Christ provides graphic examples of how far ideals can be twisted, it's fair to say, unfortunately. Apparently though, any fresh-faced idealism can be twisted into a monstrous authoritarianism or abused in some other nasty way. So perhaps the hair at the back of our necks should stand up in a chill when we hear someone shout, "A new world now!" Who wants their door to be kicked in the middle of the night, to be dragged away from their family by a brutal mob or the secret police, or whatever mask the modern witch hunt wears? The parable illustrates a tragic core principle of human history. Revolutions have this glaring pattern of causing the revolutionized society to go wrong in unforeseen ways and not create the paradise it promised. One major thing to fear about idealistic revolution is coming to find out that we're now in the grip of someone's control. This is what went wrong in our eco-parable, for instance. Despotism seems to follow the fire of radical revolutionary thought like an icy shadow, doesn't it? I also think people distrust radical or idealistic thinking because they fear the violent spectre of extremism, which follow the really hard political paradigm shifts. Such things historically frequently follow in the wake of revolution. Indeed, there are so many examples illustrating what we do when we become too certain of our ideals. I've already mentioned Christian history, which is replete with sectarian wars and the missionary-led slaughter of pagans. But there have been just as many non-religious humanitarian social perversions, including war, despotism, and ethnic cleansing. History offers diverse evidence that any type of basic thinking, religious or non-religious, can fire up its sincere acolytes into unchained frenzies of destruction. Zealousness is good when it leads to people actually doing some good. But trouble swiftly comes from the zealots of any belief system when the heretics, meaning anybody who doesn't comply, presents obstacles blocking the path to heaven or the other paradise thereafter. Finally, the self-assumed keepers of the truth come to see that to achieve their ideals, they must silence the ignorant from their interference. The meta-revolution begins by seeing that the predicament I predicted, or almost any alternative future, illustrates a general malaise, a problem that all idealistic thinking can suffer from. We know things aren't going to work out how we idealistically want them to work in socially major ways. Whatever the specific problems will turn out to be, we know that things aren't going to work out the way we'd ideally want them to work out, even if we are allowed to implement our ideals, right? The root of this tragedy might be not really thinking through your ideals, having not enough information to make a good judgment, or it might be too simply believing the propaganda. We believe the media's saturated misrepresentation of things. We're evidently prone to being manipulated and exploited after all. Imagine, for instance, that to achieve long-term ecological sustainability, some organization is going to run the world economy. With even all the best will in the world, that's a barrelful of potential problems. And we know there won't be the best will in the world, obviously. There's one extreme possibility of the future then. Suppose, as president of the global federal democracy, or whatever we call it, we get some disguised bloody Nero. I mean, imagine getting some crazy but subtle charismatic despot, a murderous but charming clinical sociopath, presiding over the earth. To replace our contemporary ideological stupidities with a set of ecologically enhanced stupidities would be pretty stupid, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it be like climbing scratched and bruised out of a crumbling mine shaft to fall off an adjacent cliff? I'm going to argue that this is a metaphor for all our possible futures if we don't learn to adapt our thinking to the truth about revolutions themselves. To starkly see the deep dilemma facing eco-revolutionaries and any other revolutionaries, let's briefly consider the Soviet Union, which anyone can point a finger at and say, well, this shows you how revolution really is. Let's start by suggesting that some of the major ideals of the Soviet Union were really desirable, which is presumably why the Russian people adopted them. I'm talking about such Marxist ideals as freedom of the masses from exploitation by the rich. Everyone does the work they're suited to by temperament, desire, education, and skill, in society where everyone has sufficient, even plenty. Let's suppose for a moment that these communist ideals are really desirable, right? Nevertheless, it didn't happen, did it? The Russian Revolution didn't work. The Russian Revolution just didn't form Russia into the ideals that justified the revolution. So, with the benefit of history, we now know that revolution means another opportunity for people to dominate or kill other people, ironically by some rationalization of tackling those same people's frustrations. But really, political revolution, like many brands of our ideological fervour, is another brutal struggle for power under the banner of high ideals. Ideological pathologies are perhaps most clearly revealed in revolutions, because after a revolutionary purge, a new ideal can be applied most purely, as it were, unhindered by anything else. So people don't fear revolutionary change because they fear things might change for the better. Only the people who hold the strings of power fear that sort of change. These strings make you and me dance our lives away to radically bad ideals, by the way. At any given moment in history, the powerful have a vested interest in keeping the order of things as it is, right? But here, I'm not talking about the fears of the powerful. I'm talking about ordinary people fearing the potential problems in radical revolutions, even when those revisions are necessary. The popular mood seems to agree with me that whatever new ideal of progress is pursued, something big's going to go wrong with it, probably quite soon. Revolution itself is questionable. It doesn't do what it promises to do. And if we haven't learnt from history to be at least cautious and skeptical when faced with deep change, then ruthless reality may still have to teach us a stone-hard lesson or two. What does this suspicion mean for how we should be thinking about social and cultural development? How we might best deal with it is in a meta-revolutionary manner. The meta-revolution's about cultures becoming seriously non-deceptive to themselves about their true values for themselves, as demonstrated by their actual behaviour. Briefly, the meta-revolution would involve making society critical of its core ideological thinking and keeping it critical. I'm interested in tackling the underlying problem humanity has with history. It's not about advocating a revolution, but about considering and maybe even solving problems with the revolutionary cycle itself. This is why it's a meta-revolution. Perhaps you suspect that society's dreams always turn sour in the end, that we always manage to foul it all up. We've made the mistake of being over-optimistic, idealistic even, about our idealism too many times. I think this is principally why the liberal West now has a very conservative dismissal of social-scale revolutionary idealism. Unfortunately, in practice, this anti-radical idealism ideal begets a repulsion for socially and economically challenging thoughts, despite the fact that the consumerist expansionism we're almost globally saturated with is highly dysfunctional false idealism. We feel that we must always plug up any mental hole potential revolution is threatening to explosively emerge from, in case it twists into totalitarianism or social collapse, gangsterism, so on and so on. Neither do we want to deny that once the dust settles over the new world, nothing will have fundamentally changed. The regrettable truth is that however the form of the society or the economy changes, people will still be under the sway of a selfish establishment, a socially dominant worldview. Even with ideals for transforming the world which seem clear, clean and uncomplicated, we suspect that these good ideas for deep change will become excuses to corrupt and waste lives. This is how it always seems to be. In historic practice, revolution or progress seems to too often mean that a new generation will be deprived, abused, perhaps killed, so that a new batch of psychopathic egotists can exercise over-controlling power, albeit now in a slightly different setting, with a different excuse, while holding different guns. So now, revolutionary pessimism is a widespread assumption. We say to ourselves that the chronic corruption and abuse of human ideals means that there's no real progress, except technologicalization. Since, although we may to a degree change the shape of society, the human condition remains the same, just because human beings remain essentially the same. It should not be surprising then that Western culture is now a bit jaded about revolution. Guess who's going to be left at the wrong end of the power structure, stooping low under the weight of its demands? Guess who's going to be left looking down the wrong end of those guns? You and me, buddy. Humanity having endured the 20th century, the idea of progress has been tainted forever with the blood that's spilt through human ideals. The ideals generated in any ideological vision can easily become destructive, one way or another. Any of our ideals could go wrong in significant ways. Any guiding thinking can be used to guide us down dead ends, we might say. It's the same story throughout space and time. Whatever happens, human nature is going to get in the way of human progress somehow. So we might now have actually learnt something from history. That whenever a group uses a theory which says how we must live, it's liable to go significantly wrong somewhere. An important caution is evidently extractable. Let me put it like this. Any ideology which directs human behaviour can potentially have negative influences on that behaviour. So the evidence of history yields the first meta-revolutionary principle of history, which is that, however justified our initial ideals, something significant's going to go wrong in their implementations if it's continued indefinitely. Let's break it down a little. First, it seems that the potential for historically or socially significant error applies to any type of thinking that affects society. Religious, political, economic, scientific, everyday, common sense, and perhaps anything else you can think of. The idea of progress, however justified our initial ideals, something significant's going to go wrong in their implementations if it's continued indefinitely. Let's break it down a little. First, it seems that the potential for historically or socially significant error applies to any type of thinking that affects society. Religious, political, economic, scientific, everyday common sense, and perhaps anything else you can think of. It's also true that the problem of significant lurking error could be active at any level of thought, from basic and widespread ideas and behaviors to sophisticated rare thinking. Put these ideas together and we can say that any of our ideas can go wrong at any levels of any beliefs, ideals, and their applications. This makes the fallibility of our thinking a universal problem. As we could ask, why should we want to go through the same cycle of revolutionary change again and again, just to again get the same results, even if they're dressed up in new uniforms? It all too quickly becomes just another excuse for a brainwash. On the other hand, we clearly now need some sort of deep economic and social revolution. For overwhelmingly practical reasons, we need to radically evolve global society. But we are already starting to feel the hard implications of our lifestyle on our lives. So I'm repeating what many horse prophets keep on saying, which is that the human race must deeply change its way of doing business. Anyway, we owe the truth to ourselves, so if nothing else, it's a matter of integrity. Shall I dishonor your intelligence then by claiming that this time the results of our revolutionary agenda will be different? Why shouldn't our eco-idealism follow the same historical pattern and go badly wrong in historically established ways? See, even if we do manage anything like a pro-ecological economic revolution, it'll be a case of our learning to live in a different sort of popular deception, or some other political disaster either waiting to happen or happening. This contradiction between what we need to happen and therefore do and the sort of results we anticipate from our actions creates a conundrum, clearly. Any sort of revolution will probably fail us badly, but we still need revolution. I call this the paradox of revolution. We need radical change. Our world is being processed by the present industrial complex into too bad a state for us to leave the process as it is. However, history tells us how bad applied political scale idealism turns out. And who knows what unknown evil spirits may be lurking inside global eco-revolutionary's black box, waiting to burst free. We know about this dangerous potential even before we take the next big ideological step on the long road. So perhaps it's better for us to stay in our present dying process. It's better to stay stuck in our fast-sliding avalanche to global collapse than risk the terrors of a global bloodbath, isn't it? So what are we going to do? Are we going to stand still while things crescendo up and grind down? Will we be lion-hearted revolutionaries and try to change the world somehow, even though we know that our ideals are going to go radically wrong, utilizing the worst facets of human nature, with some mix of prejudice, complacency, fear, brutality, dim-wittedness, and any other negative attributes we can find to bung into the cauldron? We still need to be able to continually develop, right, socially, even developing our ideals. So, what can we do about the revolutionary paradox? Is there any way we can prevent the implementation of our ideals from going disastrously wrong? We're first going to have to consider how historical change works. For the sake of argument, let's assume that we do need radical economic change globally. An unfortunate consequence of the constancy of human nature is that even if we do manage to change the global economic system into something more long-term oriented, we're bound to screw it up in the short or medium term anyway. Thus, the paradox of revolution comes into play. We know we need major change, even while knowing that things will go wrong as a result of these major changes, often in unexpected ways. This predicament of our present is just one example of a central problem for humanity throughout history, which is the fallibility of our applied ideals. The core problem of history takes in the entire smouldering field of human conflict, covering the entire unfolding bloody battlefield of global society, past, present and future. The first meta-revolutionary principle of history goes, the corruption of applied ideals is a probable outcome for any ideology or worldview, even somewhat successful ones. The second meta-revolutionary principle of history is that we can't get everything right forever in our present thinking and its unchanging application. If we knew and did everything perfectly, there'd be no deep historical problem. But every application of ideals is susceptible to the fallibility of our humanity, if only because what once may have been appropriate can quickly become no longer so. Even the best paradigm of political progress could never inform its perpetrators for all the unseeable future. The limitation, corruption, or basic error in implied ideals applies to what I call the basic cycle of historical development, by which I mean the basic way or pattern by which human societies and cultures develop through time. Let me summarize the basic cycle of history like this. Revolutionary or other radical change is continually needed to overcome what goes significantly wrong with what the previous radical change creates. In other words, the primary cycle of history happens because it takes a profound change to free us from the unpleasant effects of previous profound changes. We hurtle through history, replacing one way of thinking and living by another way of thinking and the lifestyles that go with it. And the major part of the need for the new ideology is to solve problems created by the working of the previous ideology, or which are unresolved by it. But once the new revolution's happened, the base historic cycle inevitably starts again, because any applied idealism and its ideas always has limitations, meaning that the new situation will be as open to decay, corruption and abuse as the old, albeit in novel ways. The claim of humanity's enduring a base historic cycle can be justified through the combined claims. First, that fundamental social change will inevitably be necessary because of fundamental changes in conditions, including knowledge and thinking. And next, that the new thinking by which society deals with the problem will always be limited too, at least to the extent of not being able to deal with all coming circumstances forever. I think the base cycle of history is the rhythm of human life from a long perspective. So the cycle suggests a tragic redefinition of human history. History is the working out of the limitations of the ideas guiding societies. Unchallenged, the basic pattern of history means that humanity is destined to fail its future too. For instance, suppose we do create an ecologically sustainable global economy. The ideals through which this revolution happens, whatever they're going to be, will start out as good, I'm sure, but will also turn out to be limited and ultimately socially damaging if never updated as the circumstances change. The paradox of revolution, the idea that we need revolution but we also know how bad it's going to be, we might say is the result of our becoming aware of the basic pattern of history as it applies to us. The deep problem as it applies to us is that revolution could well push us out of the global gash we're falling into now, But what's to stop the thinking digging ditches for us to fall into later? So any new world we create will eventually itself require a revolution. And as long as we haven't learnt how to escape or ameliorate the historic cycle of replacing problem social scale thinking with problem social scale thinking, we'll be trapped in the historic cycle's hydrolyte coils. Revolutionary change has elements we see repeatedly in history. For instance, the new cycle begins when a new regime becomes established using a new ideology. Then, as the pattern of history goes, for the sake of the power they've gained, the newly powerful do what's in their power to make their subjects continue to believe the ideology their power is justified by. Many will believe it too. After all, no one will be officially taught to question it. I consider this pattern of re-education to be a rule of thumb about all ideological change. In fact, the process of power re-establishment justified by a novel ideology with subsequent popular re-education according to the new dogma happens throughout history as an inevitable part of the basic cycle of history. Certainly we can see this pattern of new thinking with popular re-education exemplified many times with Hellenization, Christianization, Islamicization, and indeed perhaps in any other large-scaleization, including our currently trendy liberal humanization. You know this pattern of re-education isn't a myth. We too clearly see revolutionary reprogramming happening so many times in the saga of history, with the usual consequences of missionary hatred, prejudice, injustice, and general error, which frequently come with the popular acceptance of new, true, final, absolute thinking. Well, I got me some essential headline news for you, sunshine. It may not be as obvious as it is with a totalitarian society, but we too are caught in an ideological education process. We too are in a society which operates media saturation thought control. We're continually being conditioned by consumeristic, materialistic ideals. This is manipulation in the modern world, often without any self-reflection by the manipulators. You know this indoctrination. You must do, you live in it every day. Or maybe you've never thought about it. Perhaps we only recognize this as indoctrination because we're beginning to understand we can't grow industrially forever on a small earth. The question is raw consumer capitalism unchecked good long-term thinking for humanity? And the answer is, of course it isn't. Generally speaking, societies go off the tracks when seduced by erroneous ideals, and they continue off the rails and over the cliff as their bad guiding thinking continues unchallenged. Or to plant another metaphor in the soil of your mind, certainty about what are in fact errors allows a bad worldview to take root, and continuing investment in this error will allow this inadequate idealism to grow and in time bear the harvest of its consequences. And I'm not talking cherries. The fruit of bad ideology is the thorns of social destruction. Indeed, the sharp effects of ideological error apply to most of the standout parts of history. Consider, for instance, how 20th century totalitarianism could have been weakened if the errors and limits of the thinking behind those idealisms were more widely publicised. The communism which recognised when it was so wrong as to promote totalitarianism might have created an honourable alternative economy instead of the multiple nightmares Marx's over-optimistic and undercritic utopianism did give birth to. Aren't you tempted to agree that many of the worst events of history, the famines, genocides, invasions, have their roots in the uncriticised application of some idealism or other? Again, consider our materialist expansionism, our globalised consumer capitalism, and the harvest that this is already reaping for the world. So the bad effects for societies of ongoing bad guiding thinking in its politics, society and economics is a major problem for the present too. This indicates that it'll also be a major problem for the future if we're complacent enough to let it be. Hence the paradox of revolution, that we know we need to change the global economic paradigm, but we also know how imperfect that revolution is going to be. To overcome the revolutionary paradox, maybe we can try to answer the question, how can we overcome the underlying cycle of ideological change and replacement? Can't we at least minimize the effects of bad revolutionary thinking after bad revolutionary thinking? To answer this question would be to go beyond seeking a revolutionary solution to our growing predicament, to seeking a solution to the underlying issue which necessitates such revolutions. To Metarevolution. I want to begin by generalizing Thomas Kuhn's principles for change in the history of science, which are found in his book The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Bearing in mind that Kuhn specifically wrote about developments in scientific understanding, I want to apply his theory to revolutionary change across history per se. A Kuhnian analysis applied to history generally gives us two major categories by which to consider changes in socially dominant worldviews. The first category concerns what we can in a Kuhnian way call the normal development of a culture. In science, this means that there's a set of established principles and ideas to guide scientific research. In life, we might call it a continuation of a way of thinking. Normal development involves a set of ideas having a steady influence as they continue to recreate a basically similar situation. I take it to mean that people just want things to develop as basically normal, as they consider normal. But the second category of Kuhnian revolution concerns the replacement of basic thinking and the concurrent behaviour. Following Kuhn, we can call this revolutionary development, which is indeed what we have been calling it. Kuhn coined the term paradigm shift to refer to the revolutionary changes in scientific understanding, as for instance when Newton was absorbed by Einstein, or classical physics by quantum mechanics, or young Earth creationism was replaced by natural selection. Once the paradigm shift change in thought sets in, things proceed in that paradigm for a while. As Kuhn says about scientific change, once the revolution's occurred, the revolutionary thinking becomes the normal thinking, and the new paradigm yields normal progress under its influence. Until a revolutionary paradigm shift happens again, when the old paradigm meets problems which can only be overcome by the application of some new basic ideas. And so the revolutionary cycle is complete. Thus, revolutionary development and normal development together constitute the basic historical cycle. Let's first ask, what triggers the basic negative cycle of history, the need for revolution after revolution? The need for revolutionary change in ideas and life is often created through the influence of the established ideas. But not always though, as social scale problems also come in from the outside in the form of wars, invasions, plagues, and so on. We should also note that the division between the normal and revolutionary effects of ideas applies as much to the effects of good, true ideas as it does to the effects of bad, false ones, in that true ideas can also influence the growth of thought and shift into good revolutions. However, good historical influences are not part of the problem of history and the paradox of revolution. We're concerned with the destructive effects of false ideas and what to do about that, in order to know what to do about our basic and future ideological threats. I think there's two main aspects which necessitate ideological paradigm shifts, aka revolutions. The first element, which causes societies to go so wrong that they need radical change, is ongoing bad thought in the basics. By bad thinking, I mean any influential ideas which are false and so dangerous to think with. They're either misleading or destabilizing. On the scale we're interested in, we're talking about the bad thinking a society makes its decisions by, such as what informs its economics, laws, morality or politics. This means we're concerned with what I've been calling ideology or worldview, and especially with the socially dominant ideology or worldview, the thinking that predominantly sets the behaviour of societies. There's often bad thinking pervading the reasoning justifying whole society's behaviours. Even thinking which starts off good can turn bad as circumstances change, through the application of that very thinking even. This is confirmed by the history of consumerism, for example. It wasn't so bad until it started putting pressures on the ecosystem, as it's doing now. Now it is so bad. The second basic aspect which catalyses the next phase in the cycle of revolution is that there are ongoing bad basic patterns of living for societies generated through the bad fundamental thinking. Through bad basic ideas, whole societies can get into ways of acting which will do them no good, and probably no good to the world around them too. These two simple yet foundational truths of history are connected in that a society will get itself into and continue in bad patterns of living because of the bad thinking it allows itself to be basically influenced by, until revolutionary change is necessary. Allow me to sketch how bad thinking produces its results. This sketch is so basic it applies to bad thinking at both the personal and historic scale. But for our purposes it will help to primarily think about it more in terms of its application to society. 3 stages of the application of limited social scale thinking I want to spotlight are the creation, the establishment, and the continuation or growth of invalid ideological principles. First, an error in guiding ideas creates wrong developments in thought and living. Ignorance of the error will then allow bad idealism and its influence to establish itself. And if bad thinking established social-wide is not adequately rooted out, it will continue to run its influential course across society. Bad applied ideals can cause or necessitate basic change by accident, by negligence, that is, through intellectual complacency, or by the deliberate misuse of ideals, The fundamental problem the meta-revolution addresses is, once ignorance or a complacent attitude allows bad thinking or limited ideas to gain a foothold in a culture, this inadequacy of awareness will also allow those ideas to continue working, guiding society's acts, until a change is necessitated. Now, it may be that significant error in ideas is at work from the start of the application of that thinking, that an ideology or worldview starts working out badly from day one of its implementation. Or it may be that some of the revolutionary thought and its practices were initially fit for good social functioning, but have become increasingly inappropriate as circumstances and needs have changed and the thinking has not. What was initially good has become bad because there are always limitations in the ideas that motivate the actions, if only because the ideas are being interpreted and applied by human minds. From fascist lies and the falsehoods of other racisms to the sharp revolutionary terror of the strict rationalists of France, throughout history, too many people have too easily believed the ideological assumptions that they were saturated in. And thus too many people have continued in too many bad ways of being, from the global genocidal disasters of European colonialism to the manipulations of communism, which so quickly became a bad excuse for totalitarianism. The persistence, that is, the perpetuation of bad thought, relies on bad assumptions underlying how its thinkers see the truth. The over-reliance on unjustified core assumptions has happened notably in history. I won't give another political example right now. Instead, let me cite the medieval European adoption of Aristotelian physics. Aristotle had some strange to us views, such as all motion is either circular or in straight lines. Such notions about motions were justified only by Aristotle's cunning in abstract thought, not by anything as mundane as measuring anything. But many medieval scholars sincerely believed Aristotle's physics. Before Galileo came along, science started taking off with his revolutionary technique of experiment and measurement, and Aristotle's reality was shown only to be Aristotle's imagination. Unfortunately, the dance of everyday existence is distracting enough to ensure that the contents of the culturally dominant ideology go relatively unnoticed. The graph for cultural ideological awareness must display a normal distribution, but unusually skewed near the non-awareness end. Thus, most people just unconsciously take up the dominant assumptions of their surroundings. Often people go along with the stampede without thought for where the herd are heading. Or people may agree with a group of guiding ideas just because there's some idea in the set they agree with which allures them, but which idly persuades them of the whole set. Another sadly common denominator is that people rely on their emotions for judgment more than they rely on their considerate analysis of what they're being goaded into believing. But this means that popular opinion is easily manipulated. Politics is to a degree about managing public opinion, isn't it? And indeed, mental manipulation on a political scale has been one of the major destructive activities plaguing human society. For example, a strong case could be made that most imperialism is the result of ideological manipulation. You invade another country in the name of your country, or your God, or your political cause. Political information control in one form or another does sound like a highly credible scenario for any future society too, doesn't it? That's why I predicted that when the future goes wrong, a large part of this failure will be down to the manipulation of the people. In the coming eco-paradise, the people will still be force-fed falseness or persuasive half-truths. and we will still too easily believe them. So, unfortunately, the future will still allow new variants of the old exploitations and deceit, because for the future, just as in the present and past, we'll be unaware of the pitfalls associated with what we're socially thinking and enacting. We'll still be too easily led into unstable ideals for a variety of suspect political, ideological, intellectual and other reasons. We probably won't even be thoughtful enough to spot them until it's too late. This lack of self-awareness is to the shame of many self-assured societies, such as our own consumer capitalist one. You might think that you don't have any profound hidden assumptions, but I hope you'll accept that there are many hidden assumptions informing major ideas and activities in every society, such as the best way to farm and distribute food and other resources, who should have political power, and so on. If any of these basic assumptions are bad, the thoughts and lives that are built from them are all equally bad. What assumptions operate in your culture concerning the world the powerful are creating? And what would the very real possibility you're being deceived mean to you? Well, revolution might be one option. More blood and toil, repression and indoctrination, ultimately for nothing. Well, not for nothing. In fact, so that a few elder statesmen can die fearful, surrounded by people who tell them lies. Unfortunately, the truth seems to be that almost any ideology can be misused, and almost any honourable ideal or ethical precept can be twisted by the sophisticated rhetoric and persistent propaganda of perverse people. Humanitarian and liberal rhetoric is all too clearly as much open to misuse as any other ideological touchstone. So watch out, please. We have some insight that our consumerism cannot be the best ideal for life. Unfortunately, our economic order has become such that we have little choice or say about it. We have to focus on status via consumption in our modern society, especially if we want to reproduce, thus living lives that aren't quite right. You do know what I mean, though. Even without emphasizing the common fate of having to do the 9-to-5 thing you hate year after year. You know what I mean about the processes of society being not quite right if, for example, you're an unemployed single mum in a cramped high-rise building. The rent's going up and up, and you have to scrimp just to pay the interest on the loan for the TV. So this is progress, you might well ask. Unfortunately, the apparent popularity of not challenging basic thinking makes the ongoing repetition of the basic cycle of history highly plausible. Indeed, together, our intellectual complacency and our mental manipulation are the outstanding causes of the primary cycle of history. In other words, why we don't adapt to changing times at least quick enough to avoid the need for large-scale revolution. This pithily expresses what I've been saying is the problem of history. Bad basic thought unchecked continues to screw up our lives, one decision at a time, again and again and again. Indeed, I think the influence of bad based thinking and action is why most societies fail. A Newton-like principle of history is that ways of thinking stay active until something deactivates them. So if bad influential ideas go unchallenged or otherwise don't meet a dead end, they continue to exert their influence with impunity. Yet the most powerful errors, or the most obstinate of our foundational stupidities, will resolutely lead us into disaster. To put it bluntly, as we continue to apply significant errors in thinking and living, things will go from mad to bad to worse. It's dangerous for individuals and societies to live unthoughtfully and uncritically then, since unless we've built our social understanding soundly, it's futile building our intricate structures of ideas upon that foundation, supposedly to stand strong for 1,000 years. Without sound reasoning justifying our fundamental ideas, we'll be rashly honouring them as knowledge and reconstructing society upon this conceit, though we do not have knowledge at all, and the high possibility remains that the basically unjustified ideas we're building on are basically wrong. To build a society on truth, it's necessary to do the groundwork for your building. The rubble of basic error must first be discovered, then it must be cleared away, so that we have clean space to build the city of our new ideals on. We're in trouble if we've still got rubble. Or, to obtain a healthy body, a poisoned person must have their system purged of pollutants and toxins, perhaps in the sweat of a feverish heat. The same is true socially. We can't be socially healthy through basic intellectual and ideological corruption. We need the false beliefs out of the system and true ones in, so society can thrive in health. But let me reduce the problem with ideological complacency or ignorance to its core. The problem with following any ideas uncritically is, what happens if the ideas you're following are wrong? We too should take care in case the ideas we are acting on are also only imagination. Do we really know, beyond reasonable doubt, that the ideas we are presently acting on a social scale are true? If any ideal isn't adequately justified, it might be false, and we could be building our lives on our world out of this basic error. What's more, it seems that there's such a thin border between right and wrong, between what's factual and what's false, that it's just too easy to cross the line. It's too easy for us to get things wrong and still think we're right, that we do this all the time, often not realizing how wrong we are. Untreated, the same basic problem of complacency in the face of ideological limitations will continue to corrode every coming cultural evolution or deep development, and so all our futures. If humanity doesn't change its attitude to its fundamental thinking, the future will include all sorts of unnecessary major motions of society continuing to go wrong, unresisted by understanding or awareness. We should well fear the hardship, wars, famine, torture, exploitation, hatred, and other self-righteous, self-destructive errors our intellectual atrophy will continue to create or allow, sometimes with idealistic fervour. Our destiny, by lack of popular demand, will continue to include the systematic abuse of the people through all sorts of persuasive, glittery, slippery, but ultimately false ideals someone charming will be persuading us with. History often graphically illustrates the results bogus ideological certainty can have. Let me again cite the certain rise in the 20th century of communism and fascism. Both these social experiments quickly turned into social scale disasters for the victims of them. Speaking more generally, I suspect that if we stopped peering closely, we'll see that the root of much of our most effective mistakes historically has been a certainty that the excuses for what we're doing are valid. Perhaps then we should feel the stab of regret as we look back to see the stupidities we could have avoided, if only we had chosen to use our critical intelligence more than our brutal mass credulity. All the war and hatred and genocide and slavery, all of that. I take this lack of basic behaviour critique as pivotal to why the past has been so disastrous, the present continues to be so bad, and the future will continue to go so wrong too if we don't plug up the gap. Complacency towards applied ideals provides the crux of a lot of what's gone wrong historically. Societies don't react to what they're thinking and doing with enough insight to prevent many unnecessary disasters. Even the primary cycle of history, one new way of thinking and living eventually begetting another, can be thought of as a result of the complacent attitude to our erroneous or limited ideals. Bad ideological thinking has a lot to answer for historically, and bad ideas unstopped will continue to burn voracious ruts of ways of being for our societies. This is why we'll foreseeably always need revolution or other deep change, so that we can snatch ourselves up from whatever deep and water-filling hole we're digging ourselves into now. Our thinking can be so accepting that it doesn't even realize that there are ideological forces at work. Most people's analyses of their guiding ideals is only thinking about the practical details of how to achieve them. Living with this unhealthy mindset is a historically very popular condition, though. It seems to be the default mentality of the human race, in between paradigm shifts in society and culture, by which I mean revolution. But it means there's nothing widely at work in societies alive and powerful which would encourage the checking and renewal of ideologies and their political, social and economic applications before the circumstances force them to change. It'll be business as usual until inevitability takes its mudslide course. If you don't know what that means yet, it means history will overtake even your life. Outside events aside, the constant historic cycle of revolutions, of basic change following basic change, is necessitated by limited ideals being unsuitably applied, and all ideals are limited at least in the sense of not being applicable to every possible future circumstance without adaptation. So what should be our response to knowing that revolution begets revolution? Well, one correct response is to start a meta-revolution. One core thing this implies is that we should continually seek to understand and overcome the basic limitations of our ideal thinking and its immediate applications. Economic, social and cultural processes and structures define the nature of life for those living in them. So presumably, the human condition can be improved by developing what we create economically, socially and culturally. The development of society depends on people's ideals. Ideals ultimately direct destinies, since our ideals ultimately direct our actions. And since the course of history depends on the movement of people, everything depends on where the thinking of the people is directed, on their ideals which direct their actions. Yet what would it take to get the direction of thought right, except meta-revolution? Discovering the right direction, then continually rediscovering the right direction. Indeed, the meta-revolutionary goal can be summed up as understand our ideals, apply this understanding, and keep on reformulating our understanding. If we undertake a meta-revolution, in contrast to a revolution, we undertake to keep nudging the development of society in continually better understood directions, until we're finally going in the right direction. If we keep positively nudging the direction of human growth on a social scale, this must eventually mean society is no longer being herded down the wrong avenues, as has been the case till now, generally speaking. We've been wandering from the path of the best way for society since the birth of society, I'm sure. The random events and reactions of history have certainly produced a gallery of societies not designed to maximally benefit the mass of citizens, to put it mildly. Instead, the messy processes by which the world has been constructed means that most people have been forced to endure unnecessary negativity. Human society, we could say, is chronically, basically dysfunctional. Don't you agree? But if we collectively set our wills in the direction of a fully healthy global society, we could perhaps even begin to cure the deep-rooted resource and psychological problems of our species, and be happy as a species. Well, that would be real progress, wouldn't it? It would mean our recreation of reality would aim towards being the best it could be. We can choose to start to guide ourselves and our societies out of the maze of trenches dug by our social scale of thoughts and reaction. We can instead learn to basically improve the way we're recreating the world. We could say that by counteracting our bad attitude to our core goal thinking, perhaps even the basic cycle of history can be responded to intelligently. We might even eventually break out of the cycle of history by culturally nurturing gradual, deliberate ideological improvement. So the attitude change I'm promoting in the Metarevolution is so we can guide life into the most intelligent world humanly possible. So we need a meta-revolution in thinking, even so that how we live our lives might become fundamentally right. The meta-revolutionary point is, human life won't fundamentally grow in the most sustainably beneficial direction until we resolve, as part of our development, to continually keep searching out the deep truth of our development. In this way, a fundamentally improving society could eventually become possible. So let's do the meta-revolution. The message of a revolution within a revolution is starting to come out. Wisely changing our way of thinking about our ideal thinking will mean our working to conscientiously improve ideals and their application. Usually, when someone sees an idea as false, they stop believing it. So, thought is quality checked through critical scrutiny, which means comparing your ideas with reality and with each other for coherency too. Conversely, what allows bad thinking to continue acting in minds and on lives is for the people to not recognize that bad ideas are at work. Complacency, ignorance and credulity all allow bad ideas to thrive. We're mostly certain of the justifications by which we build our societies and steer our world, and most of these justifications are wrong. Much of the reasoning by which social scale action is instigated is not morally defendable, such as with slavery, for instance. Seen from a longer historical scale though, As we get into and continue in ruts of bad thinking on a social scale, this creates stresses, increasing the friction within societies as they collide with the world or with each other, until the next phase in the cycle of history is instigated through deep social change. So let me give a warning from history that applies to all our deep thinking, philosophical, religious, political, past, present or future. The lack of adequate critical ideological perceptiveness is one of the most basic problems for humanity throughout its history. In fact, I think this is just a different formulation of the deep problem of history. The central problem with our ideologies and our ideals is the extent of our lack of thinking about them. The resolute application of limited ideals is the basic problem of history, in the sense that it's at least the base of the basic cycle of history. The resolute application of limited ideals is what causes revolution after revolution. We'll need to overcome the way of not thinking about our ideologies and our ideals, which allows this spin of history to keep occurring. We can do this, I think, through increased cultural and social meta-revolutionary awareness. Naturally, it will be a narrow and rocky way forward. As long as no awareness of ideological change remains the dominant attitude, the human race will still be easy prey to the ideological forces which incessantly churn it about. Be as decisive and certain about the future as you want, there's still nothing in place to stop the new world from inevitably largely going wrong, so triggering another major turn in the cycle of history. So it's an obligation of practical prudence, and so of ethics, for society to work continually to better understand significant truths about its goals and behaviour. The meta-ideal is to repeatedly redirect the ideal growth of society towards being based on demonstrable ideological and other developmental truths. The meta-revolutionary aim is that our thinking about the world we're creating will continually be being rebuilt stronger from the foundation. The central hope here is that if we work a meta-revolutionary attitude deeply into cultures, there will be a continual undermining of the root of much of our basic misunderstanding and its applications. Perhaps even the deepest truth might be churned up out of it all and into society eventually. At least we'll be encouraging moving away from what's fundamentally wrong now, whenever now is for you. If we don't do this, we'll be continually reenacting the ingenious recreation of the world into a new bad social situation, albeit that we're superb at making the social situation look like it's getting better, that is, until the tree starts to bear fruit. We're looking to put into effective life an attitude which continually seeks to overcome our most fundamental errors in lives. This will involve waking up considerably. We could also say the way we respond to the ongoing need for fundamental change needs to fundamentally change. I call this change the Metarevolution. The first useful stage in using awareness to overcome any problem seems to be becoming aware that there is a problem. And the essence of what I call the primary problem of history is that too few people question deeply enough what they're being led to believe they should be doing. The Metarevolution has as its goal the planting and working in the heart of society of a truth-searching, lie-overcoming, fundamental worldview and ideals questioning thinking. The meta-revolutionary mission is to establish cultural scale responses to the needs to be continually re-seeking and re-implementing fundamental truths concerning ideologies. If you like, meta-revolution wants to instigate ongoing benign revolution, by which I mean deep change, not violent change. To achieve this goal evidently needs a firm planting of the meta-revolutionary attitude in the cores of cultures, and in particular in your culture. Meta-revolutionary minded subcultures must be established which will continually stretch and test the limits of present worldviews and ideals, and change them when necessary. Any protection against socially significant lies and errors depends on their continuing to be people perceptive enough to discover the flaws in the applied ideals. But they also need to be effectively vocal about their discoveries too. Indeed, the meta-revolution needs a subculture strong and resilient enough to continually make major ideological failings known to the larger culture. Well, it's a tall order, I know. But in rare optimistic moments, I like to think that a high point of human cultural evolution will be the creation of a society invested into the possibility of overcoming its present deepest ignorance about its own ideals and their applications. Meta-revolution is about the continual development of cultural and social ideals. Therefore, a good start for any meta-revolution would be to establish a culture of people asking, what would the best society and culture look like, given what we know now? What's stopping us from achieving that society and culture? Asking these questions in any given historical circumstance is only the first, revolutionary part of this approach, though. The meta-revolutionary would go further than the revolutionary to encourage a culture to continually ask, what would a good society and culture look like, and what's stopping us from achieving it? This means culture deliberately keeping revising what society should best be. Keeping asking what would make the best society and how could we aim towards that. Even to ask these questions when we think we've achieved it, which we won't have. I believe the point of departure must be becoming aware of having profound social, political, economic and other assumptions, then questioning them, then to systematically replace bad ideals with good, then questioning them, then to systematically replace bad ideals with good. To put it personally, to be a meta-revolutionary, you must first ask, in a revolutionary manner, what are the core problems with the goals my society is implementing? And how can I act to resolve those problems, individually or socially? But you become a meta-revolutionary by being aware that such questions need to be asked continually. For the meta-revolutionary person, practical wisdom has two faces. A meta-revolution is about being intelligently responsive to the changing times, and about being intelligently responsive to the fact that times change. The first part, intelligently responding to our circumstances, is revolutionary. The second part, intelligently responding to our responses to our circumstances, is meta-revolutionary. The revolutionary aspect concerns how best to respond to immediate social circumstances. But a meta-revolution goes one step higher. involving not just an analysis of circumstances, but an analysis of the changes of responses to circumstances. One thread connecting the levels of thought is that the social circumstances are often the result of our responses to previous circumstances. But if circumstances are a result of responses, it would surely be good to understand the responses, even to the meta-level extent. So first, the Metarevolution recommends careful ideological consideration so that a society might respond to whatever disastrous situation it's presently finding itself in as a result of applying its current ideals. But even more fundamentally, the Metarevolution recognizes the necessity of the continual critique of applied ideals. Indeed, the meta-revolutionary goal can be summed up as: understand our ideals, apply this understanding, and keep on reformulating our understanding. So how could meta-revolutionary thinking be best practically achieved? How could we get a continual asking of revolutionary questions and a continual implementation of new answers? First, how might the ongoing asking of questions of ideals be established in cultural discussion? Working meta-revolutionary thinking into society might mean establishing a systematic ongoing study of society's goals and methods of achieving them. One way could be through meta-revolutionary think tanks or other foundations established to look into ideological questions. Meta-revolutionary theory is the study of ideals through history. We might instead call meta-revolutionary theory ideals theory. One evident way of starting investigating meta-revolutionary theory would be to take principles of knowledge mining from the physical and social sciences and apply them to ideological topics to chart the motion of deep social, political and economic value truths, such as examining the ideals one's economic processes are actually pursuing, and ideally pursuing. As I say, this study would ask questions like, what's right and wrong with our present ideals? Or, what might better goals and their applications be for the world, for society, and for families and people? How are ideals applied across time? And so on. Blueprints of our ideals, both real and professed, would be studied and their implications scrutinized even as we seek to implement them. Well, preferably before we implement our ideals. Truth must survive every honest test. If a set of ideas is the truth, it will come out of the refining forge pure and sharp. The future is never a simple, predictable extrapolation from current trends. What happens in the saga of societies is never a straightforward continuation or expansion of what's happening now. So, like the weather or the churning waters of a mountain stream, we never know in any detail what sort of circumstance is going to be churned up for the future. There are too many variables influencing the outcomes. I don't want to try to imagine how implementing unforeseeable ideals will be done in unforeseeable circumstances, since what will need to be done in the future will depend upon the new circumstances. I've given my own ideals of what a good ideal or set of ideals for society might involve in other videos. But let me now invite you to conjure up in your own mind a truly good society. What would the best future society be like, do you think? Broader-minded views of progress might offer not just ever-improving technology for an ever-richer elite, but the improvement of life for most people, meaning the ongoing improvement of the social situation in which the struggle of life occurs for most. The core of a wise worldview would acknowledge that its thinking concerning its goals and their applications is imperfect and must continually change. Whether you're a Christian, atheist, Buddhist, communist, Republican, undecided, it would be good for your group to strongly bear in mind that whatever ideals you're implementing now are imperfect in their implementation and will need to change as both the situation and your understanding develop. It's better to know this than to not know it, or to deny it in some ultimately destructive manner, isn't it? I am a Christian, so this means I'd like to see the ongoing consideration of goals or ideals and their applications established in Christianity, both institutionally and personally. This means establishing in the Church effective platforms for critiques of the ideals and goals being pursued either by groups or individuals, and seeking ways to implement better ideal conclusions, and keep on re-implementing revolutionary knowledge too, of course, this being the meta-revolutionary injunction. Truth is well defined as the correspondence of a description to what it describes. Or more pithily put even, truth is an accurate description. Knowing truth, that is, knowledge of reality, is intrinsically valuable just for its own sake, regardless of what truth can do. But truth also opens up reality to us. Stridently seeking truth is the most intelligent thing we could do, since anything not true isn't worth relying on or following. And if we don't get the basic thinking right, everything derived from that thinking is liable to go wrong too. So, the truth is the most precious commodity, the ultimate treasure. So, the best way a society can function is by having a love for truth working at the core of its cultural identity, even to the basics. As I would put it, we need an active freedom of thought which conscientiously seeks truth to find it. Even if we could never demonstrate ultimate ideological truth, we'd still be right to nurture a fundamental desire to overcome ideological error, wouldn't we? You'll at least be aware that the ideas need modification. Clearly, a desire for truth is already an instinct working to pioneer progress for humanity, having carved out the sparkling veins of knowledge with which humanity has been elaborately blessed. The novel aspect of the meta-revolution is not to suggest a search for ideological truth. The novelty is instead the idea that meta-revolution is about continually uncovering ideological truth to the foundations. Putting the meta-revolution in a nutshell, then, we can say, an intelligent response to history is to establish an ideologically searching critical thought across cultures through time, discovering what deep truths we can about the thinking by which we're reacting. This mandates the continual testing of ideals, even to the basics of understanding. Let's keep looking for ideal truth. I hope you'll agree that we'd like to hope to get life right, or at least as right as humanly possible. However, we've seen that to have this hope of rational growth, we need the freedom to adapt even the pilot beacons of our ideals and goals. Importantly, meta-revolutionary thinking tells us that this scrutiny needs to be repeated. Wherever and whenever we are, we're going to be in some foundational thinking, with its resulting lifestyle. But the meta-revolutionary point is, any application of foundational thinking can be limited, erroneous, or unstable. Let me make it explicitly clear, I'm not focusing on political revolution, and I never was. I want to use our urgent need for eco-revolution to open a wider meta-revolutionary door. For me, the predicted coming revolution for sustainable global economics would only be a sideshow to the main event. The main attraction would be getting a culture committed to examining its ideals and the sources of its ideals as a serious discipline.